Okay, we are going to get started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Stephen Gitsoyan. I am the Assistant Director of Alumni and Family Relations at California Lutheran University. On behalf of the Alumni and Family Relations team, I want to welcome you to today's webinar. There's just a few housekeeping items that I want to go over before we get started. If you have any questions for Dr. Sandlin during her presentation this morning, please use the chat box located in the Zoom menu. We will also have dedicated time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. When you joined the meeting this morning, your video was off and your microphone was muted. There is no need to change these settings during the presentation to help us avoid any excess noise or disruptions. Finally, this presentation is being recorded and it will be posted on our website for your reference later today. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this morning, Dr. June Sandlin, starting her career in advertising and public relations, and served as a creative director of an agency in the Pacific Northwest, where she shapes stories to promote brands, organizations, and products. She joined the Cal Lutheran faculty in 2007 and teaches public relations and advertising in the communication department. Her research interests include authenticity, digital storytelling, and social media apologies. Her work has been published by Oxford Press, Routledge Press, and in several journals, including Public Relations Review and the Journal of Communication Management. She is a triple Cal Lutheran alum, earning her bachelor's degree in communication, master's in public administration, and doctorate in higher education leadership from Cal Lutheran. Last year, she was named a fellow in the Academy for Innovative Higher Education from Georgetown University and Arizona State. So with that introduction, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Sandlin.
Okay, thanks so much, Stephen. Welcome, everyone, and thanks so much for choosing to spend a few minutes with us this morning talking about the value and values of storytelling. I'd like to kind of go over the four things we're going to attempt to share with you today. First, of course, we have to start with the story, and because I'm a professor, of course, it also involves a test. We're going to talk about our brain on stories. So that's going to be kind of what happens with our brains when we hear stories, and then the values of stories in difficult times. And I'm going to finish off with 10 tips for everyday storytelling. So I've spent a lot of my career telling stories for organizations and for companies that connect us with brands. And so it struck me that we can also use this storytelling to connect us in this time when we're feeling somewhat disconnected. So with this webinar today, I hope that I can convince you to tell someone that you love a story about themselves or about yourself. First, let's begin with the test. So the story I'd like to share with you today, this is a picture of firefighters falling off a ladder. It appeared in the Chicago Tribune on Christmas Day. It was taken on Christmas Eve, 1951. The arrow points to two firefighters who are falling to the ground headfirst from a ladder that broke while they were fighting a large apartment fire in downtown Chicago. So here you go. Here's the test. What story would you tell about this experience if you were the firefighter falling down from the broken ladder and you survived? So would you focus on the faulty ladder, the dangerous working conditions, maybe the budget cuts that led to the use of such aging equipment? Or maybe you wouldn't tell the story at all because you'd be involved in a lawsuit and your lawyer would have advised you to keep quiet. So what story would you tell if that was you? Well, the men did survive. And the story that the man who fell from the highest point of the faulty ladder went something like this. This is the story that he told. The ladder broke and we fell from 2 stories up, but it was white Christmas. Fresh snow had just fallen. If it wasn't for the snow, we would have landed on a bare concrete sidewalk. But the fresh snow cushioned our fall and saved our lives that night. God protected us. It was truly a Christmas miracle. So what value do you hear in the way the firefighter told that story? What I heard is the way that nature and God are connected and that God protects us. And that nature is one of the ways that we can discover God. This was my dad who fell off that ladder and who framed that story for us. He framed it as a Christmas miracle. Now, he was a Navy vet. He'd been married just 3 months when this incident happened. And as you can imagine, he had many options of how to tell that story, but he chose to tell it to the family in the way that I just expressed to you. And that made all the difference, helped to frame our family value set. So he went on to have 7 kids. I'm the youngest of the 7. And even though this was years and years before I was born that this happened, this story helped to shape my worldview. Let's hear what research says about stories and how they shape our worldviews. So, both hearing and sharing them shapes our identities, affirms our values, and helps us make sense of our lives. So, narrative theorists study how stories help people make sense of the world. And I've got a quote here by one of the researchers, Dr. Jonathan Gottschall. He's the author of The Storytelling Animal, and he writes of stories, and I quote, "They teach us about the world while infecting us with emotions. The combination has been shown to change attitudes and is often more effective than nonfiction at changing beliefs." And I'm going to share in a minute some research that affirms that belief. There's a second researcher that I've quoted here, Dr. Paul Zak. He's a neuroscientist, and he focuses on what stories do to us and to our brains, what's happening in our brains when we interact with stories. So he discovered that when you're told a story, you actually release OxyContin. It's a chemical, neurochemical, and it makes us feel empathy for the characters. But not only does it make us feel empathy for the characters, it affects how we interact with others in real life. And according to Zach, he says oxytocin makes us more sensitive to social cues around us. And these cues can motivate us to engage with others. And I thought in these difficult times that Dr. Zach's research was very interesting and helpful for us to realize why stories are so important to us. The Gergens, a set of researchers, they call stories windows on the truth. And Lonnie Peterson, that's the last researcher that I have quoted on the slide. She's a psychologist, and she talks a lot about how they help build connections, stories, and trust. And they help all kinds of learners, the diverse ways that we learn, all kinds of learners understand concepts better and help us to learn better. So I think that when you take a look at the research, especially again at this time, when we're looking for connection, we're looking for a way to feel connected to each other. Telling stories is a beautiful way that happens. I want to share 2 studies that talk to us too about the way that the stories that we're consuming, because I know everyone seems to be watching a little bit more maybe of Netflix or Hulu or whatever your streaming device is. And so I think it's important for us to consider how media stories can also affect us. So I want to share two different studies about this. The first study was taken when, do you remember when we had that measles outbreak and Disneyland was kind of the place where it all began, where it was traced to starting, and that was in about 2015. And researchers from the University of Illinois and UCLA wanted to know what was involved in these anti-vaxxers attitudes. Why are people being so concerned about getting vaccines for their children, and maybe how could they change that? They were fearful that these childhood diseases that had been taken care of earlier through vaccines were now kind of resurfacing. And so what they did is they did a study with 3 different ways that they gave people information about vaccines. The first way was just a very factual kind of sheet. Here are the facts about vaccines, what they do, why they work, that kind of thing. The second was a mother's story about her child getting the disease and the outcomes of that, and even showed some pictures of the child with the disease. And then the third option was just some unrelated article. And really, what they found was that the study that changed the attitude the most, or the outcome that changed the attitude the most, was the story from the mother, not the factual information. And so I think that's really interesting too, to show the power of story. The other thing that is really interesting is that the producer of the show, the show ER, the producer of the show teamed up with a set of researchers, and in three particular episodes that they shot, they embedded some really true health information, and that they thought would give people, information about a specific disease or a condition or whatever. And then they went back and they actually tested afterwards. And the knowledge, they did a pre-test and a post-test, and certainly the health information that they gained just from watching the episodes of ER increased substantially. And so what does this tell us? This tells us that the media stories that we're consuming actually are going to impact the way that our attitudes. And so I think it's important, especially if you have children in the home, I think it's particularly important that we consider what media we're consuming, considering what attitudes are reflected in that, and see if it meshes with the family values that you have in your home. So let's go on to the next slide. I've got tips now. I'm going to give you 10 tips for everyday storytelling, because I know sometimes people feel like, well, I can't tell a story, or that's just not me. It's just not the way that I communicate. Or maybe you have a difficult time. You want to share a story, but you have a difficult time kind of finding an opening to share that story. So I just want to give you 10 tips. The first one is just find a parallel activity or a chore, something around the house that you're doing. We're around the house a lot these days, right? Something that you're doing around the house that gives you a jumping off point. And I always find like cooking is a really good kind of jumping off point. Is there a family recipe that you can make that might kind of bring back a memory of a grandfather or grandmother that some kind of thing that you want to share about them? The other tip is senses. So when there's a smell or a taste or a touch, it seems to heighten the experience for people. I know that even years and years after my grandfather died, every time I smell a cigar smell, I think of my grandfather. And so again, those kind of smells that we have, maybe it's going out in the backyard and smelling some jasmine or some lilac or anything like that. But if you can find a parallel activity that you're doing around the house that's a jumping off point for a story, those are always good places to start. So let's see. That I've got. Out of the 10 tips, I want to go over number 3. And the first one is, the 3 and 4 are kind of connected, so I'll put those together. But the first one is find an attribute in your child or your spouse or your friend that you want to share a story with, and 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 talk about a story that might have highlighted that attribute in them. So I've got a picture there of my daughter when she was young. So when one of the days when I walked out into the backyard, she was out playing in the backyard by herself, and walked out into the backyard. She had climbed all the way up to into a cherry tree, so high that I couldn't reach her. Right. So how did that make me feel? Well, it showed me that my daughter was very courageous and that was great. I loved that attribute in her, even though it made me a little nervous as a mother. And as she went on in life, she continued to do kind of courageous things. She became a pole vaulter in high school and continued that in college. And then she went to college all the way across the country. And so telling those stories about those steps that our children take or our friends take or our spouses take, that we love the attribute in them and we see it kind of played out, those are great jumping off points to kind of tell a story. Maybe it's when she's going to college and go, it doesn't surprise me that you're going far away to college, because I remember when you were 3 years old and you were out in the backyard by yourself and you climbed up to the cherry tree so high that I couldn't even find you. So those things really remember, stories shape our identities. And so by telling those stories, you're helping to shape that characteristic in that child and affirm it. Which is why I put 4 on the same page. So I put humor is okay, but shy away from telling too many stories that point out people's flaws. I mean, once in a while, it's funny to hear something that you did that was really dumb or stupid or something. But think about those characteristics that you'd like to affirm, or those behaviors that you'd like to affirm, and think about all of the times of that characteristic was repeated, maybe down through their lifespan. So, but it's a great way to affirm with our family and friends kind of why we value them and why we cherish them. So, all right, on to the next. So I put use photos as sharing as a starting point to share insights, not just sights, and then be willing to share your vulnerabilities. And again, I've kind of combined these two because I've got an experience here from the photo that I am sharing here. Look at that lovely spread. Isn't it gorgeous? So this was when I was in Morocco. I was doing some research and review of a study abroad program that we were considering adopting at Cal Lutheran, and had the opportunity to go one spring break to Morocco. And this was the lovely food that they had out. Now I could have just, shared with you that picture of food, and doesn't really tell too much of a story except for how gorgeous and beautiful it was. But I think what we need to take into consideration is that my insight, and that was how that food was eaten. So this was a communal platter, right? I have to be totally honest with you and share my vulnerability, as I've asked, and that it was really tough for me to share a communal platter. Maybe it's being the youngest of 7. I used to have to kind of protect my plates that I had enough food, right? But whatever reason, it just is really difficult for me to share off of other people's plates and stuff. And so I ate very little when I was in Morocco, even though the food was amazing. I would try and get there really quickly first, and kind of eat a little before I saw everybody else start kind of coming onto the same platter. So do you see how different that makes when you look at that picture now? Knowing my vulnerability, knowing that I had a hard time eating all this gorgeous food because it was communal platters we were eating from, what a different perspective it gives. So giving insights, not just sights, about your travel, photos that you bring back, or photos from, maybe some of your ancestors, something like that. Always try and share an insight that you might have had from the event instead of just the photo. Okay, on to 7. One is, if you're uncomfortable about spontaneous storytelling, we have a ton of digital tools out there today that can make sharing an insight just a lot of fun. And maybe you're a more technical person. You think, well, I'm more comfortable with technology than I am with kind of being verbal with other people and sharing openly with other people. Well, that's fine. We've got a ton of tools, and all of these links are going to be available to you to kind of go and explore them. And I'll share one that I just did last week. It's only 18 seconds, and it is, I started thinking about how kind of familiar but yet very different when I looked up at my the place where I keep my purse, all the hooks and things where I keep my bags and purse, my keys when I come in and out of the house, how very similar it looked, and yet how during COVID-19 it just also looked odd. And so I'm going to ask you to watch this for a minute, and then I'll share.
One of these things is not like the others. One of these things doesn't belong. Can you tell which thing is not like the other by the time I finish this song?
Okay, so do you see how I took just average, everyday kind of things that are typically around my house, my gear that I get set up with when I go off to a farmer's market, and and how when I had hung the mask there that I have to wear now when I go out to shopping or to the farmer's market, how just different it feels. And of course, if you know Sesame Street, right, that song sounded familiar to you. So I did a little mashup between kind of my insights about how this time seems, it's so average in so many ways, yet so different. So, all right. Next tips, 8 and 9. So the one is use artifacts. So artifacts are simply just things that might represent something to yourself or to someone else. You can use them to probe, hey, grandma, tell me about this potato ricer, when did you first find it, that kind of thing. Or you can have it, be something that you bring out to the kids and show them and say, hey, look, do you know what this means to me? I put a picture of my former car, which was a T-Bird, and it was the 50th anniversary edition. So it was supposed to kind of look like the T-Birds back in the 1950s. It mimicked the shape and that kind of thing. I have to tell you that when I drove that car, my husband works at University Village at a retirement community, and every time I'd go pick him up in that car, I would get the lovely stories from older gentlemen about their first car back in the 50s, or what car they drove, or when they remembered driving in their friend's T-Bird, or when that T-Bird first came out or something. So it was a real gift when you use an artifact and you open up the possibility to someone else to share their story. And so I even keep an artifact here in my office. Does anybody know what this is? It reminds me of the hard work that the women before me did. This is a sock darner. In the days when when you got a hole in your sock, you actually fixed it, right? Because commodities were hard to come by, precious. And so they would put this down in the sock and so that they could sew the hole in the sock. This was my grandmother's. And so these artifacts bring up memories, they bring up stories. And by sharing artifacts or by asking someone else to share one, you can really create a lot of stories that way. The other thing is just try not to judge other stories. Just know that they're sharing a piece of them. Again, because it builds our identities, and we're sharing our values, it's something very precious if someone else shares a story with you. So try and receive it that way, honoring the person's experience, even though it may be different than ours, honoring what they have to say. And a lot of times it's really funny if you tell, because like I said, I've got 7 kids in my family. And so our age difference is really, quite significant. And to hear my version of a story of an event that happened in my family versus my older sister's version of a story, they oftentimes can be very different. And again, that's their experience, that's their story. And you have to honor the differences that you hear, and also their perspective. And my last tip, sometimes you just don't need to say anything, right? Just share a photo. So, this is of course in Paris. Look at the crowds by the Eiffel Tower, and then in our day of dealing with COVID-19 and all of the different, sheltering in place, the difference of that place. So again, if you feel really uncomfortable about sharing stories, you can just maybe sometimes share some pictures. I want to end with, it was back in, I think it was 96 when I served as an AmeriCorps volunteer. And I worked in a literacy program for young students, kindergarten through 3rd grade. And this book was one of the favorite books that the kindergartners used to have me read to them. And it's called White Wave, A Chinese Tale. And I love the way the last page of the story goes. And so I'm going to read it to you today. When the old man died, the shell was lost. In the time, the shrine too disappeared, and all that remained was the story. But that is how it is with all of us. When we die, all that remains is the story. So thanks so much for joining us today. And I hope that you have a wonderful day. If there's any questions, we can take those, but um, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Sandlin. Thank you for sharing your stories with us this morning. That was a wonderful presentation, and I hope everyone on the call found it useful during these times. As a reminder, if you have any questions for Dr. Sandlin about the presentation, please feel free to use the chat feature on Zoom, and we can go through some of those. But first, Dr. Sandlin, I'm wondering, I mean, you talked about vulnerabilities and stories, and I think during this time, people are kind of facing their own vulnerabilities with stress levels and fear and anxiety. Do you have any tips on, kind of facing your own vulnerabilities and sharing them in your stories with family and friends during these times?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that if you are blessed enough to have older people in your life, people that have gone through, maybe lived through World War II or Vietnam or other really difficult, maybe the Depression, other difficult times in our situations. Maybe you just have a parent who lived through the earthquake in California in 1993, I think it was, when we had a very large earthquake. Any other difficult times, and if they can kind of share their stories of how they felt during those times, because it gives us hope, right? That these events were in the past. People that we know lived through them, survived them, and now we are in a present difficult situation, and we will look forward to kind of the hope of this too shall pass, right? This too shall pass, and remembering just how other people kind of got through them. And the other thing is too, I'm a real fan of digital stories or stories on social media platforms. And, you have to be careful. There's a lot of negativity out there. But I think if we focus on the positive, and maybe if you get if you start a Facebook group or other things that are positive, you can really get motivated, and also just, it's good to know we're not alone. So I think that connecting via Zoom, connecting via phone calls, if that's what you have at your disposal, but any, FaceTiming, any way to connect with other people and just let them know that, you're feeling the same thing. But I know my friends and I have been Zooming probably a lot more than when we normally did. Maybe we've got a little bit more time on our hands. And we do kind of also harken back to, things that we were doing before the stay in place orders were put into place. And that also helps us kind of remember normalcy.
Great, thank you. And you touched a little bit on media consumption in that response. And the next question is kind of about media and like how much is too much? Like how do you recognize in yourself that like you have enough, you've read enough stories online, and maybe it's time to take a break from those?
Yeah.
Where does that kind of like self-awareness come about when it comes to media?
Yeah, that's a great question, because one of the things you mentioned in there is self-awareness, which means we're dealing with adults, but we have to remember a lot of us have children in the homes. And so any media really, if they're under 2, there should be no media, period. So under 2 years old, no screen time for them, unless it's FaceTiming with grandma. Okay, well that's okay, but no other screen time media for anybody under 2. After that, I think a lot of it depends on the person, right? So sometimes people feel comfort in kind of, being up to date on reading the news, and other times people are feeling overwhelmed. I think what you said is just kind of self-monitoring, and feeling like if you're starting to feel overwhelmed or negative or whatever, that's time to like stop, looking up the news online and start maybe making a phone call to some family and friends.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Sandlin. It doesn't look like there's any other questions in the chat, so I guess we will wrap it up. I want to extend another huge thank you to Dr. Sandlin for taking the time this morning to share this presentation with us and to share her stories. I hope everyone found value in that presentation and will go share some stories with family and friends during this time. And I want to thank all of you for joining us on the call this morning. Just a quick plug for our next webinar next week, targeted to those small business owners and entrepreneurs. Mike Benitez will be presenting on startup survival during this pandemic. So for all those small business owners, please feel free to attend and share with your networks. But again, thank you, Dr. Sandlin. Thank you to everyone on the call this morning. I hope everyone is staying safe, staying healthy, and taking care of each other.
Thanks, Stephen. Bye-bye.